Welcome back to the McCann Dogs podcast, season 2, episode 6?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, episode 6.
Good guess, though.
Yeah, thanks. I'm starting to lose track a little bit. It's so much fun that we're back. We're in a podcast studio. We're able to sit down and have these conversations. It had been more than a year since we had done the podcast previously, and our last setup was a little, it wasn't great.
This is much nicer. We're spoiled now.
Absolutely. And in fact, speaking of podcasts, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the road to Disney, making sense of distractions. Now, looking at our YouTube channel, hearing from our students, this is a really common challenge. How do you take what you're teaching your dog? How do you take these skills and apply them to the real world? How do you go from teaching your dog to sit or to walk at your side in your hallway to walking your dog at your side at Disney World, which maybe one day again will be a possibility. But Shannon, you've broken this down in a really interesting way. And actually, you've written an article that you've published on our website. I'll include a link to the article in the show notes below if you'd like to read it as well. But we need to talk a little bit about how you approach the idea of creating more challenging distractions for your dog and taking your dog training skills out in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. I always use the analogy with my students that trying to train the dog to do something in the face of distractions is akin to trying to do calculus while riding a roller coaster. So hence the Disney analogy. Probably the most exciting place on earth, or at least that's close enough to their slogan.
Oh boy.
Now Mickey has entered the studio. He's joining our podcast today, our guest.
This episode is not sponsored by Disney.
So basically that over-the-top environment where everything is so exciting and the dog is just so overfaced by the distraction, that is the goal. But getting there takes some skill. It takes some time, it takes some practice, and it takes some energy that you've put into training the dog. So we can't just go out to Disney and expect our dog to be able to do calculus on that roller coaster. However, that's a really interesting concept, but I digress. However, the fact of the matter is we all want dogs that can listen in the face of distraction or in the quiet room. Yeah. So we need to get to the point. We need to bridge that gap. And that's what this episode is all about today.
And we want these skills to work when we actually need them.
Exactly. Absolutely. That's the most important time.
The first point that I see in your article is that humans can conceptualize where dogs can't. And there's so often we hear people using very human language for dog behavior. I think this is an important topic to lead off with.
Yeah, for sure. I like to break this down for people as much as possible because I think in terms of the dog, not only do they not know that there's a more desirable behavior in that situation, they don't even know they're supposed to be learning. Right? Yeah. So we can conceptualize. If I go to school, if I set out to go to a math class, I've got my books, I've got my pencil, I've got my calculator, hopefully if I'm a good enough student, and I know that I'm there to learn. So I'm setting myself up for this optimal learning situation by paying attention, by focusing, by making sure I've slept well the night before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we do for ourselves when we know that we need to learn and we need to focus on things, is we set ourselves up for really good learning. And then unfortunately with our dogs, we do the exact opposite. We go out in the real world and we let them be overfaced by distractions out on the street, and we expect them to learn how to walk nicely with us in that situation. And again, that's where we get back to calculus on the roller coaster. It's just an impossibility. There's way too much energy. There's way too much excitement in terms of focusing on something that they don't even know they're supposed to be focusing on. Their natural instincts are telling them to focus on that exciting thing over there that they can't get to. And you end up with this situation where now you're working against each other because your dog doesn't really... I often used to tell a story to my mother or joke around with my mother. She had a CKC Spaniel named Willie, and he was just a little guy and just a sweet guy. And they got along beautifully, despite that my mom wasn't really good at enforcing any rules. But it's okay. It worked great for their relationship. So Willie used to take my mom for walks around the neighborhood. And I always used to joke around with my mom and say, you know what? Willie would probably have a much nicer life if he didn't think his job was to pull you around the neighborhood. Like, I want to get there, and there's this 100-pound woman dragging behind me. Well, I'm just going to have to dig in and pull pull her along with me to get to that thing that I want because there's resistance there.
He missed his calling as a sled dog.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? He would have led the running. What's the Cool Runnings movie? He would have been great in that. Yeah. So basically, I always used to think that poor Willie would think that that was his responsibility. That was his job in this situation. Dogs can't conceptualize like we do. And we need to set them up for that optimal learning situation. We need to create a scene where there's nothing competing for their attention so that we can train the concepts that we want to train. And then from there we can build. But the first thing that we need to do is make sure that our dogs are set up for that optimal learning situation. They're not distracted by the dog down the street or the exciting thing in the other yard. They're focused on us because there's nothing else that's really exciting to compete with that idea.
The other thing you often talk about is training mode? Training mode doesn't exist. This makes me think a little bit about that and the fact that you always want to be ready for some training. If you have a dog that you're working on some behavior skill, whatever, that you're inserting training throughout the course of your day so that your dog doesn't see you put on your bait pouch and get your training leash out or training piece of equipment and start using it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really important with any skill that you're teaching your dog is that the first thing you do is you make it valuable for the dog to pay attention and listen to that skill. So in order to do that, we need to have their focus. We need to be able to imprint that skill and create an association that's pleasant with responding to their name, for example. You know, if you start teaching that in a park where they're focused on so many other things that there's no way they can even hear you, they're never going to learn that that's a valuable thing to listen to. But if you first take them out of that distracting situation and start teaching them that when they hear their name, wonderful things happen, you can then start to slowly add in the challenges and the distractions, and you can keep teaching them that despite that one small distraction, it's really worthwhile to listen to you because you have amazing things to reward them with.
And to put them in a position where they're likely to make the right choices and they're likely to have a successful training session. You talk about using something or putting them in an environment that's similar to a white room.
Yeah, you bet. So nothing to compete whatsoever with what you're trying to teach. And that gives that has your dog sitting at the desk, pen and paper in hand, notes at the ready. You know, that's the situation where they're going to be able to pay attention to what you're teaching, and they're going to be able to start to identify some of the skills that you're trying to teach them.
I see comments that come through on our YouTube channel, and one of our recent videos, I don't even remember which one it was, but someone mentioned that I live in a city setting. How am I supposed to find a place that has no distractions? And I immediately remembered times when we would be doing a show in downtown Toronto. If you're familiar with the area, downtown Toronto is a very busy place, but we'd be doing a show at like a main intersection in downtown Toronto. And it was great because we could bring young dogs in training and go find a spot, find somewhere that was just enough grass. It doesn't even need to be grass, just enough space so that the dog could be successful. When you talk about a white room, you're not literally talking about, I don't want anyone to run out and go buy white paint. And new furniture. You're talking about an area where the dog you're not competing with the level of distraction around you.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically something that is not novel for the dog, not that exciting for the dog. And to be honest, I usually start this stuff in my house. Yeah. So by the time we get to, the small spot in Toronto where we're looking for a quiet area, our dogs have already had a ton of repetition in even quieter environments than that. So the white room in my house, I would basically create. For myself, I usually use my kitchen, or sometimes I'll use my bathroom because it's a little bit of a smaller space and I can sort of contain things a little bit better. If I'm starting retrieves, for example, I usually will use my bathroom because there's nowhere else to go.
An empty hallway is a great example that I can think of as well, because there's nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. Close all your doors, and the dogs don't really have much option. So the obvious option is coming back to you, especially if you're nice and close, and then you get to let them know that choice is so amazing that it ends up with a big party as a reward, sometimes food, etc. Like all of that value being built is what is going to help you when you go out in the real world and the distractions are something present for the dog. It's that history of reinforcement. It's the dog knowing that when I do this, great things happen, and creating that habitual behavior then becomes what the dog does natural.
The history of reinforcement is such an important thing to be teaching showing to our dogs. It's got to be something that we're always mindful of when we start to increase the level of distraction, or we're starting to make a skill a little bit more challenging. But the number of times you need to work through something, to practice something, and is vitally important. And you mentioned in your article the number of reps will surprise you, and I think that's the case for a lot of dog owners.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to get in enough repetition that your dog is fluid at the behavior before you start to build on that. Basically, what I do is I let the dog dictate. So if I know that he's gotten to the point where, for example, if I'm working on a response to name, there's nothing else in the room, I can, from a couple of feet behind him, if he's looking over in the corner for some reason, I can say his name and he'll turn on a dime in order to get the reward that I've got for him. I know that that dog is ready to now have a little bit of a challenge. So it can be hard to find a balance because we don't want to stagnate at one level for too long, because then, of course, when we do bring in novel stimuli, it ends up being overwhelming for the dog because all of a sudden we went from 0 to this other exciting thing. But we also don't want to pile so much on that our dogs are overfaced. So I like to use the word systematic when I'm talking about adding distractions. And before I change my environment, I will actually up the distractions in the environment that I'm training in. Mm-hmm. So as an example, that white room, rather than continuing to just let it be an empty room, I might get a little container of food and toss it off in the corner there. My dog's going to know it's there. He's not going to be able to get to it, though. That's the secret. I need to make sure that I don't ever let him get to the reward that I don't want him to find value in. I want him to learn that those rewards, those options are off limits whenever I am interacting with them. So I will have a leash on. I'll make sure that he can't get all the way to the food bag, but it's something that might grab his attention. And then from there, I'm going to practice the response to name again. I'm going to make sure that the rewards coming are very high value. I'm going to mix them up as well so that my puppy keeps guessing. That's a big thing. It's sort of like pulling up your chair to the slot machine versus going to the bank machine, right? If we go to the slot machine, there's that excitement and anticipation of what might be coming next versus the bank machine, which, the only exciting thing is if you suddenly have more money than you did. And
which is sadly never the case.
Yeah, exactly. Let's face it, that's probably not going to happen. So we want that element of surprise. So if my puppy turns, I might pull out a tug toy and have a play. I might just call a playtime and have a little romp and fun session with him. I might run away from him so he gets to chase me. I might throw a toy between my legs so that he gets an instant sort of gratification of that toy as soon as he turns around and he can chase it through my legs. Then I can turn and we can have a little play. Or, of course, I might feed several times if it was a really good response. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add more distractions. So once he says, yeah, I can handle that food in the corner is a piece of cake. I can handle that. No problem. Now I'm going to add maybe a toy, or I'm going to add another bit of food or something else that's going to be enticing to my dog. And it's really dependent on your dog what distractions you use. It's got to be something that dog finds enticing. So, for example, with Reggie, I would put food as a distraction. I would put at like a level 25 for him. That is a tough distraction for him because he's my walking stomach dog, whereas Ned is much more reasonable about food. He loves food, but he's not going to break down walls to get a tiny little crumb of cheese like Reggie would. There would be no hesitation with Reggie. So I'm going to use those distraction factors to my advantage. I'm going to make sure that with Ned, eventually I'm working up to the point where he can turn off a tennis ball because that is one of his highest value rewards. But I'm also going to make sure that I have a tennis ball to reward him with a lot of the time so that he knows, you know what, you leave that, but great things happen when you do. It's never a wasted choice and you're never being deprived of anything. You're always going to get something better.
The idea that what gets measured gets improved is the case in when you're talking about this kind of training. I'm also thinking a little bit when you're talking about, what's that level of distraction? What's the reward that my dog really finds valuable? The thing that you get listening to podcasts like this and hearing from a dog trainer's perspective is that you start to learn that when I recognize my dog loves something, I should write it down.
Yeah.
Make a note of it. Somehow, record the fact that my dog chose a tennis ball over all of the other 4 toys on the ground. They actually left food for this thing, and you can now know that number one, this might not be the distraction that you start with when you begin training a skill exercise, but it could definitely be the reward for a job well done.
Absolutely. And if I was struggling with an exercise, for example, if I was struggling with a response to name, that would be a great way to proof things out. I basically taking that white room, adding a distraction that's not that exciting and having something that's amazing in response is going to be a great way of building value for my dog turning on their name. I wanted to make a point about what you just said. You said, write it down. And I think this is a really important thing to do for so many things that happen in your dog's life. I always have like a scratch pad type of journal that I run along with every dog. Nowadays, it's electronic. It's on my phone, of course, because who actually writes anything anymore? But I always have a running list of things that I've noticed about my dog, because over time you can make comparisons. You can draw parallels between things. And a lot of the times those will answer questions for you in terms of your plans heading forward, or even something obscure. Last night on our Zoom calls with our online training students, we were talking about a sudden change in one of the dog's behaviors. And basically the dog went from being really cooperative, really sweet, really eager to work, to being disengaged for about a week. And then after that week was up, the dog was back to being normal. Well, it just happens to be around the end of teething time with that puppy. And I said to the student, you know what? It's likely a response, a pain response from the dog for that week. They probably weren't feeling very well. So you saw that disengagement. I said, write that down, because it is really good to know what kind of pain response your dog is going to offer. Because in the future, when you note that that dog has disengaged for some reason and it seems odd, well, maybe it's time for a trip to the vet.
Yeah.
Make note of those things. So important. That was an aside.
No, I think it was a really good point. It also speaks to some of the conversations that we have in our online training program. And now we're going to get to the ladder, something that you talk about when we're on that road to Disneyland with our dogs in just a minute. But, the reason we're able to sit here and chat to you guys, and the reason that Shannon and I can sit across from one another and make bad jokes while being recorded is because of our online training programs. And specifically, we got a message from Barbara who's in our life skills program, and I wanted to read it really quickly. And Barbara says, I've run large companies and I'm a marketer at heart and trying to stay up with digital engagement strategies. And then I experienced the McCann dog training. I was telling my husband, you've got the formula right, not just how-to videos, but Zoom calls, daily Q&A, personal coaching, etc. Billy and I are Puppy Essentials graduates and now in life skills. The experience has been amazing. Foundational build. This is my second Border Collie and I'm learning so much. Thank you for putting us in the center of your formula. The impact is huge. I always get asked how I know how to train my pup. I tell everyone about you. Thank you from Billy and I. This is a virtual model that could work for kids at school, etc. Keep rocking it. So I'm going to drop a link in the description below to our life skills program. If you have a dog over 5 months, that program is right for you. And if you have a dog under 5 months, we have a Puppy Essentials program as well. So check out the show notes below. And thank you, Barbara, for the really nice message. Let's talk about, I guess we've talked a little bit about distraction levels when it comes to the road to Disney. Now we need to talk about the idea of the ladder. And I am I try to be tactical and calculated as I increase the challenge. Again, we've been talking a little bit about recording our successes and our challenges and identifying what our dog loves and maybe what they're less interested in. How do you apply the ladder to getting to that ultimately distracting environment and still have your dog listen reliably?
Yeah, you bet. This is how we need to break down our distractions. So we never want to go from that white room all the way to Disney and expect that our dogs are going to have a fair shot at learning, or that they're even going to pick up on the skills that we want them to learn. And then the frustration sets in. And of course, we end up with a dog that basically just never leaves the backyard because they're too difficult to handle. So bridging that gap, the ladder is a great way to bridge that gap. Think about the bottom rung being that white room where nothing is in it, and the top rung is Disney. The top rung is the most distracting environment your dog is ever going to be in and need to listen in. And each rung of the ladder needs to be a different set of criteria, and you can set your own criteria. Your lives will be different than other people's lives with their dogs. We all have our unique situations. So you might live on a farm where your dog doesn't ever see a lot of things that they would see in the city. They might only see, one car every 10 minutes, etc. So being socialized and being able to listen around traffic is probably not going to be your top priority. But being able to come from a distance, if you live on 20 acres, is probably going to be a really big priority for you. So think about the things that you need to work on. There's certainly different things in dog training that you'll want to incorporate into your training, regardless of whether you're going to use them or not. Things that build emotional control, things that build relationship. There's a bigger purpose for them than just that particular skill in a lot of cases. But when it comes to the particular skills that are going to be important to you, if you're living on a farm, you probably won't be walking your dog on leash all that often. So you don't need to spend all that time working on loose lead walking, but you do need to spend a lot of time teaching your dog to come when they're called, because they might be off sniffing in a bush, or they might catch wind of a deer or something like that to start to chase. But we can't start with the deer right off the bat. We've got to control the situation enough that you can take the step from the bottom rung of the ladder in the house to now you're working out in the front yard or working out in the backyard as an example, and then adding distractions to that environment. Rung 3 on the ladder might be getting out to the back field where there's swamp and potentially deer and critters and frogs and all sorts of interesting things. Basically just a systematic way of stepping up your distractions to the point where your dog can handle them. They're basically learning through success.
We talk a lot about the 3 Ds, distance, distraction, and duration. Now, when you're mentioning the ladder, I'd imagine you're talking about one of those things at a time, because maybe you're working on your recall, for example, maybe the distance is the first one that you try, and then you add a little distraction, and that's the next ladder. But what I'm not going to do is go for distance and then distance and distraction, et cetera. Being very careful not to overface the dog, because, we're going to work through some of that stuff, but that's in the proofing. We need to teach some foundation first.
Absolutely. And what you've just described is stacking things. So that's always something you have to consider as well. If I am thinking about distractions as an example, stacking my distractions, there might be a really distracting smell. There might be a really distracting sight. There might be really distracting noises. And I need to be very conscious of those things. So as I'm evaluating a new environment to work in, I want to make sure that I take note of some of those things. If there's water off to the side, for example, with Ned, that is going to really factor into my training plans, because Ned loves all things water. That would be his number one thing. If you've listened to the podcast.
Being a toller.
Yeah, exactly. But if you've listened to the podcast, you've heard me talk about using water to my advantage to train Ned and proof out his ability to listen around water. So it's really important for me in an environment to note if there's water in the environment. If there's bush off to the side, that's going to add smelling distractions. He's an intact male, so he's always thinking through his nose. So I need to make sure that I'm aware of those things. Not that I'm avoiding those things. I need to train up to the level of those things, but I don't want to be stuck in the situation where I've overfaced him and now he's not learning. I'm frustrated. I start calling him stubborn. We give up on the whole thing. It's just not the way to go. Yeah.
And, as you climb this ladder, it doesn't mean that you're going to remain in that same position. I'm thinking about, the really rural setting where we talked about someone who lives on a farm. Maybe they only need the recall. That's the one skill that they're really focused on keeping up. And they haven't used it in 3 months, and they had a young dog in training, and every day or every other day they were working on it. These are the kinds of things that you want to go back to, go back to the second rung if you were at the 5th rung. Right.
Absolutely. And on that note, training is a lifetime thing. Just like with us, if we don't keep working on our skills, they will fade. We will lose the ability to have certain skills if we're not practicing them. And it's so important with our dogs too, that every once in a while we dust off the training equipment, even with, 13-year-old Reggie. I'll practice things. Right now, we're actually practicing a lot of hand signals because he is now completely deaf, which has been a gradual process. And I've been working on, sharpening up his signals all along to make sure that I can still enjoy life with him and he can still enjoy life as well. Of course, he has to be on leash now being deaf, but...
and maybe that's another podcast topic, maybe that's something that we can talk about, is some of the aging, the symptoms of aging, and how you can actually train for some of these things, or if you recognize that there's some kind of issue, that you can give your dog a new skill that replaces whatever the verbal was, if in the example of your dog being deaf, because this is something that I'm working on a little bit right now with Mac and Deacon, really still as you mentioned, training's a lifetime thing. Deacon's almost 17 years old.
That's
and I'll
amazing.
and she's relatively healthy considering her age, and I'll still reward her for a great response to name. Now, I'm not too far away from her, and I will have her online because her vision's going a little bit, but when I get a great turn, a motivated turn, I'm going to reward those kinds of things.
Old dogs are so special.
Oh, I know. Yeah, absolutely. This is how you're going to have that dog that you can take from home and go to the cottage and get the same response. Maybe you go over to your friend's house and you can show off how obedient your dog is. The amount of times that online students or in class have mentioned like, oh, my friends are just so amazed at how he'll listen to me, and their dog's, running around in circles barking at them or, whatever the situation is. But this is when you understand that training is something that you can just insert into your everyday.
Absolutely.
And you have you're thinking in the way of the ladder, and you're able to sort of scale the challenge. This is why the dog ends up motivated, why the dog reliably listens.
Yeah. And it's fun these days to train dogs.
Yeah.
It used to be a situation where there really wasn't the tools, that we didn't have the tools that we have now. So training would consist of going out into those locations where it was busy and basically just making the dog do it. Yeah. And a lot of the times using unpleasant methods to do so. And we've come so far and we've learned so much. And the McCann method has always, way back when Deb and Marty started McCann Professional Dog Trainers, it was because nobody was willing to use food in dog training, and they knew that there was a better way to do things.
We should definitely have them on one time because, I spent a lot of time with Marty and Deb, and in hearing some of the stories from back in the day when they started their own dog training business, when they left the obedience club that they were with because they wanted to use food.
Yes.
And how food now, lots and lots of people are using food to train their dogs, but the insight that they had is really amazing. And that is very nearly 40 years ago.
Amazing.
39 years ago that McCann Dogs was started.
Yeah.
But some really interesting stories. But, I think we can recognize that the more motivated the dog is to listen, the more likely they're going to do that regardless of the environment.
Absolutely. And then the great thing is watching our students light up when their dogs get it right.
Oh,
and the
totally.
joy in the relationship that's built. It's amazing. And with my own dogs, every time I have a new puppy and they start to come along and I start to see these skills develop, and I'm so excited for them. And I'm so excited for me and the learning that we've done together. It's remarkable.
We were talking a little bit earlier about knowing when to make things harder, knowing when your dog is ready. And I was thinking about Euchre in our household and other dogs that I've owned and trained as well. When I started to see them turn faster, when I started to see them sit fast, the very things that I was very acutely aware of were like the snappier turns or the faster recalls or the better sits. And that's when you can up the challenge. That's next. Okay, well, this is working really great. Now let's take a step up on go up the next rung on the ladder and make it a little bit more challenging. If you're sort of listening to this thinking like, well, what's that? How do I know? How do I know when to go on to the next rung? That might be it for you. Maybe your dog is, lies down in an enthusiastic way that they hadn't done before. Maybe I would be over the moon excited in that situation, and I'd let them know that they made a great choice. But I'm also, the next time, maybe I can make it a little bit more challenging.
Yeah. And that is a sign that your dog is showing confidence in that skill, which is wonderful. So we always say speed comes with confidence. People always ask us, yeah, my dog will do it, but they're really slow with it. And that's because it's still a new skill and they're still figuring it out and their wheels are still turning. So when you start to see speed, you can recognize that as confidence, that they are understanding what the job is. They're getting that little endorphin rush for being right. They're enjoying the process. And then you can build a challenge in from there.
Well, Shannon, I think you've given lots of great tips and helped people on the road to Disneyland in those distracting environments. I want to thank you for joining me here in the podcast today. And I want to thank you, those of you at home, for listening. If this is your first time here on our podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button or follow button. We're publishing new podcasts every week to help you have a well-behaved four-legged family member. And on that note, I'm Ken.
I'm Shannon.
Happy training.
Bye for now, everybody.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the McCann Dogs podcast. And if you'd like some more training resources, be sure to check us out on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook at McCann Dogs. And if you'd like to train with us online, be sure to check out the show notes below for our My Dog Can online training program, where we know in just a few weeks your dog will become a well-behaved family member. Until then, happy training.